First of all, thanks to the Department of History at University of Kerala for inviting me to share my work, particularly Dr. Sajna. And I'm really happy to be sharing the panel with Dr. Sebastian, who has been a nice interlocutor in the recent past. At this point, I feel like I'm posed with, benchmarks of several kinds. One is a very, very, very illuminating, lucid lecture by Dr. Sebastian. And then I'm sure that all of your sumptuous lunch is waiting for you. So quite a tall task for me to, to kind of meet up to these expectations. In a sense, I start where Dr. Sebastian just left the conversation. He focused on the film text rather, and the relationship with the film text to history, or in other words, how do you understand film as history, right? Whereas what I do is to look at the site of cinema itself, which is, cinema in its cinema as institution, cinema as social practice, cinema as commodity, and cinema as archive, all of the material practices that constitute cinema as something to contest with, right? Like, how do you read history? How do you do history of cinema? Addressing these kinds of practices as well, right? Like, can you write a history of cinema by just looking at a film text? Will you be able to write a history of cinema by looking at what transacted in the cinema halls, for example, around the cinema halls? Is the history of cinema going to be somewhat, if not complete, but complex enough if we don't think about the publics and the audiences that come into the space of cinema hall? So these are some of the questions that animate my work. So in a sense, I also think that it's a little bit of, and I think it's a beautiful, moment now in academic practice that there is Dr. Sebastian Joseph, who holds a PhD in history, but who is talking about the film text, its semantic, semiotic, and indexical properties. And here I am, who holds a PhD in cinema studies from JNU School of Arts and Aesthetics, and did film history, went into archives, embraced the methodology of history, learning from the rich and vibrant atmosphere of JNU. So I think this moment is also academically quite interesting for us to think about the demands on history writing from the margins of other disciplines, right? So this is where, so I won't elaborate on that. So when I was invited to speak by Dr. Sajna, I was also a little, I was thinking whether I should be talking about contemporary films and history, or should I be moving to the past? And I thought probably this is also an opportunity to share, some of my work with young historians who work on Kerala. This is also my forthcoming manuscript, which is on inquiring the possibilities of a princely state cinema, its publics and its sensory history, right? So what I'm going to do today is to kind of look at a very complex, multi-layered kind of conversations that unfold in the Srimulam Prajasabha debates in the 1920s, following the decades of 1910s, where there is a lot of chaos around cinema hall exhibitions. There is a lot of churning that happens in the Travancore society at that point of time. The cinema comes into that matrix. It initiates a number of changes. I'll come to that one by one, some of which you already have sort of engaged with in popular history. And then I look at how does cinema in these contexts get constituted as a legal object, right? What is the tensions involved there? What is the friction that is reflected in the Travancore, debates on cinema hall? How is it understood as a kind of governable object, right? How can one understand the various elements that constitute cinema, which is its audience, which is the cinema halls, which is the machine itself, the technology of it, or in other words, if to use a slightly more complex term that captures everything, the techno-material assemblage that is cinema. How was the Travancore Legislative Assembly debates trying to engage with that, and what do we how can we read those archives is what I'm trying to attempt today. So it's not going to be as exciting as Dr. Sebastian's lecture, which has very live examples of contemporary cinema and so on. But I do have some excerpts and so on, which I'm going to kind of put out for you to watch. But just very briefly, before we go into that, into the actual assembly debates, I also want to kind of lay out, or probably signal some things which all of us already know, which is that the period that I'm talking about, which is 1900 to 1930 and the 1930s, is also considered to be a very accelerated urban growth in Travancore, right? With all the cities that we know, all the towns that we know, starts, sort of emerging, acquiring visible urban form from the late 19th century onwards. And it's an important period in the history of Travancore where smaller administrative towns, agricultural market towns, and temple towns, etc., start acquiring this kind of a form, and is brought under the control of municipality acts and constituted as new urban, units. The municipalities also acquired power to levy tax and provide facilities such as hospitals, public transport, burial and burning grounds, and markets, housing, community spaces, etc., public parks, and so on. The city of Thiruvithamkur particularly enjoyed this new urban status as the administrative center of the princely state, and becomes the principal higher education, has a lot of principal higher education institutions as well. So until this time, from the late, we start seeing in the archives the circulation of cinema in Travancore primarily, but also in other parts like of Cochin and Calicut and so on, right from the early years of the 1900s, right? So we have some of the first records of people watching cinematograph exhibition from 1903 onwards. In fact, one of the first records of cinematograph exhibitions is from 1903, and some of the largest, exhibitors in South India comes from the trading class, the Syrian Christian trading class from Thrissur city, contemporary Thrissur city, the Thrissur town then, in Cochin state, who held cinematograph exhibitions in different parts of South India, where something like, for example, the Joe's Bioscope could hold cinematograph exhibitions where some 3,000 people could be seated, right? So there are reports from Salem, towns like Salem, where this kind of exhibitions have happened. Now it's a completely different question, what would people watch in this kind of big crowd and so on. That is a different question of exploring the phenomenology of the audience and so on. I will leave that question there. But there is the presence of cinema from the early years of 1900s onwards. In Travancore, from the 1907, we have a really interesting account by someone who wrote the biography of the last, of Sri Chitra Tirunal's mother, right? The book called Avasanatha Naduvariyude Amma, which talks about palace ceremonies in which there would be gramophone later in the 1930s. But in 1907, public screenings of cinematograph for the larger public as part of palace ceremonies, commemoration, coronation, etc. These kind of events. And we do have enough, evidence that there is the presence of cinema from the early years of 1900s for us to, take note of. From the 1920s onwards, which is also when newspapers start reporting on cinema events, we have many more accounts of film exhibition, different kinds of conflicts in cinema halls, what kind of cinemas are coming here, who are the patrons, and so on. So I'm saying that cinema arrives into a matrix of relations, social relations in the 1900s, and increasingly starts posing new questions that reconfigures existing alignments of social categories. I mean, what do I mean by that, for example? So, for example, it means that either there were, and this is what I discern from the accounts in newspapers, either it led to some kind of, caste-related tensions, very often within the cinema hall. There are a few accounts of that. Or they also had to reconfigure the cinema hall space, which has the potential of being a leveling space where people were in abstract supposed to sit and watch films together. But we know that did not happen. What we know is that there are several kinds of, either categorization of the audience according to their buying power, or purely according to the social categories, that this is where women sit, this is where other castes sit, this is where people of the administration sit, etc. So this kind of division of the cinema hall. So in other words, like what Karthikeshu Sivathampi, this very, very, in his quite insightful work written in the right in the 1970s, Sri Lankan scholar who worked on Tamil cinema, points towards how cinema halls increasingly became a leveling space as India started gaining independence, and parallelly to the different kinds of social reform and caste reform movements that happened, right? So keeping this in the background, we can also think about this times of temporary cinematic exhibitions, also peripatetic cinematic exhibitions, where it's basically the traveling film units and exhibitors and so on who traveled with this whole techno-material kind of infrastructure from villages to towns and so on, and even to mountain areas exhibiting cinema, right? So once this is established, it's also important for us to think about what this widening of social spaces meant, right? What it meant spatially and temporally, what kind of patterns did it create? So one of the important, social upheavals to be kept in mind at this time is that it's also the early decades of the 20th century also witnessed powerful oppressed caste movements demanding access and entry to the public domain, such as schools, temples, and free use of public roads, etc. This is a history known to all of us, eventually transforming Travancore into a new social order. Now, within this newly emerging social order, groups and activities deemed geographically segregated, socially marginalized, and or imperceptible were becoming visible public actors. So we also need to think about film, the history of cinema as something, or cinema as commodity, as text, as an institution, as technology, etc., to be simultaneously coming into this kind of a set of relations. So, and it's also quite, pointed out quite rightly by Dr. Sebastian, it also was accessible and appealing to fantasy and mass consumption, popular theater, quite like, popular theater, circus, and many other cultural feats, cumulatively working towards a democratic subversion of an older social order. right? So what I also want to flag then is that for us to keep in mind is this big spatial churning which is happening through different kinds of public, spaces that is emerging. You can create parallels with the, with 17th or 18th century European cities where there are new kinds of public spaces emerging, salons and cinema halls and photograph booths and so on and so forth. But also, it also brings in new questions of senses of proximity, of touchability, etc. in the public as well, right? So the late scholar Aniket Javare, for example, argues that every, what the material divisions that historically govern bodies in Indian social life, right, are significantly around figural touching rather than literal touching. So this kind of figural touching, which can happen by just being in one space, was quite powerful, drawing upon scholars like Javare and scholars like, Kartikesu Sivathambi and so on. So these insights, should help us think about then what did cinema then challenge, pose as a new domain to be governed, right? So apart from all of this, apart from this kind of changes that it is forcing into the social order, there is also the domain of culture and legality, where new practices around cinema, such as the adoption of licensing systems from elsewhere, emergent patterns of patronage, right? Who has the right to run a cinematograph exhibition? How can they be governed? How can it be brought under certain schema? An unspecified schema of segregation of audiences. Also, all these starts posing a variety of exhibition practices of cinema, right? And all of these differing notions about the new technology, its curious commodity form, its ownership pattern, and the spatial reorganization that it was capable of engendering, finds a place in the first legislative debates to license cinema in Thiruvithamkur, right? So what I'm trying to do is to think about what are the different kind of challenges that are emerging here. Let me also at this point share my PowerPoint, now to give a brief history of what is the, when does cinematograph regulations happen? The British cinematograph regulation happens for the British provinces in 1918, but that's not binding the princely states, which all of you might already know. The Cochin Legislative Assembly has a Cinematograph Act legislated in 1925 before the Travancore Act. The Travancore Cinematograph Bill is presented in 1926 to the Assembly, and it's taken up for council discussion in 1927 and passed in 1927. And it poses several interesting questions for us to think about the very question of how are new domains of culture brought under governmentality, right? So to kind of also flag off what is happening otherwise in the context of what other debates have happened around cinematograph regulations in early 20th century. In the context of colonial cinema, the works of Poonam Arora, Prem Chowdhury, Priya Jaykumar are extremely illuminating. Poonam Arora, for example, offers a very psychoanalytical reading of British anxiety over the increase in inclusive and public on-screen spaces, right? So we would be, it might not be so surprising, but the reason for this is something which is governed by a certain kind of racial anxiety, right? With the more and more spread of British and Hollywood melodramas depicting multiracial images to a mixed race crowd in Indian theaters is something which starts posing a certain kind of racial anxiety among the imperial, administrators. Prem Chowdhury, on the other hand, provides very insightful, observations about the reception of imperialist British films in India. Right. So what they try to do, both Arora and Chowdhury try to do, is to situate their readings of British policies and films firmly within the context of a declining British Empire, to narrate their effects on race relations, post-colonial nationalism, and imperial ideology in general. Priya Jayakumar, on the other hand, looks at what is called, this is interesting also, and this is also one of the reasons why I chose the Travancore Legislative Assembly debates to subject it to a kind of comparative study with what Priya Jayakumar offers in her work on what is known as the first, so something which is known to everybody would be that, all of you as history students, would be that the British had deployed very elaborate knowledge exercises, right, where they would in detail research into practices, objects, commodities of various kinds before implementing policies, or for their own for deepening their understanding, and in order to also devise policies that benefit them better. So in the context of this kind of racial anxiety that I just described above, and also in the context of establishing monopoly over the imperial, I mean, you should also imagine that we're talking in 1920s and 30s, Britain also holds a significant power over the world market. But interestingly enough, it's not British films which had this kind of traction and this kind of presence in their own colonies, but rather it was after the First World War, the European films started gaining more, of a market presence in their own colonies. So in order to establish, to address these two questions, one, address the question of racial anxiety and how to control around that. Two, the question of how to implement a quota system where British films have a certain percentage of the film market in their colonies. They established something called the Indian Cinematograph Committee around the same time in the 1926, right? So this is what Priya Jayakumar analyzes, and what she shows in her work is that methodologically she shows that policy process as not as reactive to social context, but as an intrinsic part of it, right? So therefore, she considers regulatory discourses to be open to the kind of analysis that post-colonial cultural critics brought to bear on cinematic narratives and images, right? So, so in other words, I'm saying that I find this kind of a methodological shift really important and aiding me in providing me a comparative framework to understand the Travancore Assembly debates as a process of communication and contest, where members of the state and elected representatives try to make sense of a very fledgling distribution system and the components that make up the constitution of cinema, the cinematograph machine, and the audience. Now, instead of limiting ourselves to study of policy effects, a study of this debates and discourse will help us reconceptualize the cinematic institution itself. So, as I mentioned earlier, the 1927 regulation, which became an act, sought to primarily regulate exhibition spaces. The process of regulating these spaces also, it's not just emerging out of a vacuum, as I said. It is something which is responding to the tensions, certain kinds of conflicts, etc. But also administratively, it's something which is informed by a set of correspondences with authorities from towns, from smaller towns, like say towns like Haripad, Vaikam, Kollam, Alapi is a big site of such correspondences, etc. Now, while there is a hue and cry over the lewdness of Hollywood films in the ICC report, which all of these scholars mention, The Travancore legislation doesn't seem to be very concerned about it. The Travancore legislation instead, right, were fraught with tensions over developing strategies to regulate the incipient industry, right? And this is a very productive kind of tension, as we will see. The debates were more concerned about licensing of films, asking questions of what is criminality, where is the power invested in licensing authority, the nature of control that the government can have or not have, and so on. So to decipher this complex relationship between production, distribution, and exhibition of this particular commodity, it undertook a series of discussions within the Legislative Assembly. Now, while discussing the possible punishment for someone who violated the conditions of the license, the council was quite unsure about whether a punishment like the forfeiture of the film could be met out, and if this punishment would be for the exhibitor, since the film is not owned by him, right, basically, but usually by a film company elsewhere, such as in Bombay, Pune, Madras, Paris, or London, which is clearly outside the jurisdiction of the Travancore state. This is quite exemplary of the malleability of such regulatory practices. So it's also interesting to think at this point that they were quite unaware of the organization of production practices and labor relations within which the film commodity circulated internationally, right? So you will see several questions such as this in the Travancore Assembly debates. So it's populated by this kind of the sense of crisis and the sense of how to govern over this. And so if you can strain your eyes and read it, it would help you to understand what is being transacted there. So what is interesting is that the regulation, when placed in the Legislative Council, had clauses that gave control to the government and not to the licensing authority. But the legislators debate and on the grounds that creating a nebulous atmosphere on the issue of licenses is what would emerge, and they started, and it was amended to create an autonomous licensing body according to the rules framed by the government, right? So that it was also unsure about the kind of immoral text that could appear. This is quite surprising given the fact that that was a main concern in various other kinds of legislations and inquiries. Again, the perception of crime remained elusive for the Legislative Council. It was variously described as a technical flaw by some and as a criminal act by others, and just a merely unsocial act by certain others, right? So these are also interesting sort of conceptual categories to think about, whether unsocial is always criminal, right? Or can technical flaws be mapped onto something called criminal? These codes then clearly show the malleability of this entertainment practice and the invisibility of its economy. And the dilemma regarding this new commodity would be captured very best in P.K. Narayanapillai's words when he discusses the confiscation of a film as a punishment for breaching the license. And I'm going to just now inherent. So something which all of these exchanges that allows us to think is that inherent in any commodity process, any commodity situation is the process of exchange. The legislative debates were cognizant of the commodity status of cinema, but they were quite and the underlying concerns over the invisibility of the circuits of exchange and ownership, etc. Right? So quite like what Terry Ramsey describes the early decades of the American film industry as a lawless frontier. The haziness in the quote that if you can read it in P.K. Narayanapillai's statement, is about this chaotic network of exchange that is cutting across nations and ruled by disparate regimes of law. Also, again, the author of the film was not so important in these debates, because the author was invisible to at this point in circulation. And this is not a time when the ideas of copyright, of intellectual propriety, etc., forms part of film as a commodity, unlike books and so on. So again, though Thiruvithamkur was a princely state with the status of a politically autonomous unit, it was deeply imbricated in colonial relations across politics and economics, including and also in the realm of culture. As a system of regulation, the colonial legal regime varied considerably in its institutional, juridical, and cultural elaborations. The cultures of legality in the princely state was a contested process involving the production of social order, citizenship, and subjection. So what we see in the debates are also the how are new regimes of law compared within the specificities or brought into the specificity of Travancore and brought sense and made sense within the Travancore law apparatus, right? So, and this is also something which is done in the context of various other kinds of histories of land relations and so on, and land legislations, etc. So, for example, Leigh Mercier, in his discussion on the colonial legislative procedures in Travancore, closely examines the ambivalence around the conception of land relations in the debates, in the legislative assembly debates. This ambivalence, which is much more in this case, is about the public domain of cinema. In many contexts of legal ordering, then, the state administration employed methods akin to legal cultures in other colonies. So they would compare with other, princely states and so on, and constantly compare themselves as a model state and not to follow the British, legal system, because the relationship of the British to its subjects, the subjects that they rule, and the relationship of the Travancore state, they analyze is different, right? So what becomes model states in this comparative framework is not actually the British legal system or the British acts and regulations, but most importantly, states like Baroda, states like Mysore, Cochin, and parts of Punjab, etc., are brought into this kind of a schema of comparison, in which they're compared to the realities and specificities of the princely state before accepting, right? So in fact, the forfeiture of the film material is rejected on the grounds that we need not be acting like the British, right? Because the British don't have the same kind of relationship with their the subjects that we have, right? So these are some of the really important kind of terms and concepts that emerge within the context of the Travancore Legislative Assembly debates. The ambiguities regarding these very many terms were crucial for a state like Travancore, whose economic and political power had to be constantly negotiated with care. At the site of cinema, these relations were confounded by the vast circuits of exchange through which films traveled to Travancore. Travancore's autonomy in the realm of culture and the social relations that often shaped the Legislative Assembly debates came under question during the enactment of the film regulations. For example, they did not want to call it regulation, but an act, because of they did not want to call it an act, but a regulation, in order to keep to a certain reality of film circulation in Travancore, which they found as dissimilar to the British, British context, right, or in the British rule. By the 1920s, the British Indian law had supplied enough to deal with this new technology and played a pivotal role in regulating it. Yet, the intricate debates, full of detail and painstaking exploration into each and every term that is arising in very many of these similar acts, creates a feel of actually a fresh encounter. In his discussion of the beginnings of Indian cinema, Madhav Prasad, the film theoretician, has pointed to the issues involved in thinking about the medium as a technology born elsewhere, with a form shaped by in particular contingent localities, right? So the Travancore Assembly debates on cinema were not just making order out of chaos, neither were they just attempts that constitute cinema as a legal object. Instead, they asked the important question, what is a cinematograph? These deliberations were complicated attempts to know cinema by deploying knowledge of other cinemas, institutions elsewhere, and an elaborate mapping of similarity and difference from other entertainment forms like that. So the comparative schema that I'm talking about is with other political units and entities, but also with other entertainment forms like drama, like Harikatha Kalakshepam, like circus, and commodities like the book, for example. Right? So in this attempt to know the object of cinema and its practices, its technological base, and the human agents become really important. The cinematograph might appear as placeless and timeless, but it needed to be placed within the terms that were place specific. In this case, Travancore, right? So so in that sense, it's a first attempt of its kind that we are, that is available to us in the archives to think about, cinema's many lives, as a legal object in the during the colonial time. So, as I said earlier, the cinematograph regulation was the first domain of culture to be recognized as a site of governmentality. The mode of rule proposed in the regulation had its linchpin in the term population. Right? So cinema, we can read from all these debates then that the domain of the population, understood at a very biopolitical level, a domain to be controlled and governed not through coercive power, but through reformist intervention on part of the government. So the new cinematograph regulation then reflects the understanding of an emergent social domain, while simultaneously giving form to that domain through its institutional effects. These institutional effects of law, in order to discipline film exhibition in Travancore, did not transform cinema into a completely governable domain, which we will see very soon in the decades of 1930s and 1940s. This so if we move to this slide, for example, there are immediately after the regulation comes into being is also there are several questions that arise about various constitutional aspects of cinema. One is a series of correspondence about this is 1930s and different kinds of sound. Not as sound cinema in particular, that happens only by the mid-1930s, but gramophone records which are played along with the cinematograph exhibitions, etc., becomes an important source of noise in the urban sphere. And there is a number of exchanges between various municipal authorities all around Travancore, which starts arguing for controlling and governing this kind of sensory assault of the public sphere, right? So there are also several other kinds of ways in which the noise starts percolating into the cinema hall, outside the cinema hall, etc. I mean, two quick examples. One of the archival records, something which I met in the archival records is how the noise from a cinema hall pollutes the functioning of the nearby religious places of worship. One of which happens in Thrissur, for example, which is a city where there is a temple in the middle, and there is the different kinds of cinema halls arranged around. This is happening in the mid 1930s. where in the Cochin Legislative Assembly, there is a debate emerging about how the band performance, right, before the cinema hall, in this case, the Joes Theatre, which is a really big theatre, a prominent theatre in Thrissur city, disrupts the afternoon, ceremony, what is called the Trippuga, the afternoon ceremony, the afternoon ritual with in the Vadakunathan temple. How the noise kind of disrupts that, that sacred sonic, ecology of the temple, and you will see several other kinds of examples about sound. A second kind is something which is related to the how cinema halls are seen as more and more miasmic, creating more not just noise pollution, but also as a site of various kinds of diseases, and which is an older phenomena, which is something which starts happening in the 1920s, along with big epidemics like cholera and so on, but which continues into the 1930s and ends in, and I've written elsewhere about this, where the urban reformers in Trivandrum city in particular, and in this case, Anna Chandi, the urban reformer, and who's also a very important figure in the history, in women's history, who pioneers a petition asking the authorities to remove theaters near the Women's and Children's Hospital in Taikat from the vicinity in order to allow women to heal properly, again in a certain kind of noise-free, pollution-free kind of. So this kind of reading of cinema as a very polluting space and reform around that is also another development in the 1930s. And we all are aware of this is part of popular history. This is also huge archives that is mobilized by Dalit, scholars and activists and Dalit historians, etc., in the recent past, who had pointed to the, who had visibilized the immense violence against P.K. Rosi, the first actress of the Malayalam film screen, but also the first Dalit woman actress of Malayalam screen, and perhaps many other silver screens in India, who met with violence soon after the screening of the film Vikatakumaran. Pointing to more relations of caste capital and technology, and the particularly cracked nature of cinema halls in this particular sense. Again, there are also, so if these are complaints from certain kinds of urban reformers and so on, and there are also certain other kinds of developments that happen, one of which is, I'll also quickly show some of the documents that that emerged from my archives. This is the letter from the Bhagavati Vilas Theatre in Alleppey, complaining to the government about the constant threats to close down the theatre because of the complaints about noise pollution. This is again something which is from the, this is what I'm going to talk about, the resident of Travancore, right? The British resident of Travancore initiates a series of letters to the palace and the authorities in 1935, demanding the closure of temporary exhibition halls 3 kilometers away in Pottirikandam Maidanam, which the letter argues is, and this is a bundle of letters, and there are a series of correspondences that happen between various kinds of offices about the sound traveling to the Kanagakunda Palace, right, palace grounds, and disturbing the peaceful existence of the resident. All of this also lead to the establishment of permanent, cinema halls in the by the late 1930s. Of course, it's a hybrid, ecology of cinema exhibition in Kerala for a really long time, like everywhere else in India. But there are more and more permanent, exhibition halls coming up, marking certain parts of the city spatially by the late 1930s through all of this. What I'm trying to say is that what we encounter in these debates and this attempt to govern cinema halls is also is not just a question of governing. It's a question of governing the publics through governing senses, but also governing spaces, right? And pushing the institution, pushing the government towards standardization and rationalization of exhibition practices and the normalization of the object of cinema. The more that push happened, the more intensely did the issue of viewing practices come up to emphasize the specific commodity nature of cinematographs, right? The curio nature of the cinematograph exhibition, which found expression in cinematograph regulation debates in a tacit manner, which is that what is this object? What does it tell us about the place? How can we understand this? How do we control this, etc.? Features more prominently in these cases that I just described, like of noise, of pollution, etc., in the post-regulation phase in the 1920s. So, and they throw open few questions related to cinema in different ways, right? So, which is that is cinema a completely governable kind of domain at any point? Is it a kind of a slippery object of legality, and so on? So all these questions then still continue to dominate the site of cinema, as all of us, are very well aware that if there is one kind of regulation happening, there is also certain. So there's so many debates around piracy, about different kinds of copying, what OTT platforms bring, etc. So although I talked about something else, I'm also gesturing back to, before I end in conclusion, to something which Dr. Sebastian kind of pointed out, which is that this sort of extra diegetic that cinema always holds, right? It is more than the text. It's more than the institution. It's more than the cinema hall. It's more than the law. There is always a little more, and there is always something, or in other words, there is something which is a little in excess in the context of cinema. And thus, as I'm making my case to you historians to look at cinema more seriously, right? And to embrace cinema as a very, very active site where some of the questions of history can be reposed and transferred to, and maybe found new answers. So thank you.
I would like to ask you one question only, because depending on the cultural landscape of Cochin and Travancore, depending on the kind of demographic transition that were happening in Cochin, which was very different from the demographic transition or slower transition happening in Travancore. Have you noticed any kind of governmental regime attitude change in Cochin in comparison with the Travancore?
Good question, thank you. But so the Cochin Legislative Assembly was the first to legislate something like this. But unfortunately, it's like all history work. I'm also strapped by the paucity of sources. The Cochin Legislative Act doesn't pose such interesting context of. It seemed to have something which just which takes the British Act. This is what the Legislative Act, it's actually a 3-page kind of document in which there is a comparison with the Mysore Act and the British Act, and they just accept it without much discussions, right? The Travancore Assembly Acts, I mean, if we were to just think about the legislative, assembly debates, on the other hand, subjects and scrutinizes the all aspects of the machinery to all of these questions. So, but on the other hand, if we were to think about the about practices around, if we leave the legislation aspect of it and look at practices around cinema, Cochin Post is actually very interesting, sort of context. So, for example, some of the largest exhibitors in South India, and actually who can be compared to big exhibitors of the early cinema period, like the Menon pictures in Calcutta, who had exhibitions in Burma, and who had exhibitions across South Asia, actually. Bangladesh, Burma, all of those, even to parts of Southeast Asia. They had comparable sort of, machinery and infrastructure and so on. I mean, infrastructure in the older sense of the word. And these all came from, it's interesting that it comes from old, merchant capital, in fact. This is the Thrissur, the credit, the chit fund credit kind of surplus capital that go into this big exhibitor. So there are 4 or 5 big exhibitors from Thrissur who has a sort of monopoly in South India in the early part, right? But interestingly, from the exhibition, once it moves to kind of very located production in the 1930s, where you needed studios and so on and so forth, this capital seems to be drying up, right? It doesn't move from. So these are questions to really think about, but also one is working against so many, sort of, lack of, sources and so on. I really wanted to look at the chit fund, sort of records and so on. And there was a big fire in Thrissur just a couple of years ago, which had probably blown up everybody's dreams, not just mine, but also for economic historians. So, but this is also something to think about. And there seems to be that sort of capital seems to be drying up right around when the peripatetic exhibition phase ends. Right? Once that ends, that capital doesn't seem to be moving to production. That comes from Travancore. Right, so for example, the National Pictures in Kollam is one of the first big exhibitors to take productions from films from Madras and seem to be exhibiting here, etc. So this is how I would put it. Like, in the sense, if you look at the cultural practice around cinema, its popularity, its circulation, kind of entrepreneurship, etc. There is much more interesting happening in Cochin. But whereas it comes to, but there is some kind of a drying up of that by late 1930s. Okay. So, okay. There is a question in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Share your observations on the incorporation of history in the context of the film studies. Thanks, Anil. Well, that's a really vast kind of, I don't know whether I will be able to address that right away, but there is, history has been explored in its I think in its multiple, potential in Indian film studies, because people have looked extensively into contexts of exhibition, like even in Malayalam, like, for example, apart from my dissertation, there's also a really interesting book by the popular, the literary critic and journalist P.K. Rajashekharan, who has a book on cinema halls in Trivandrum city, right? Which is an interesting book with a lot of information about the development of the city, urban urban reorganization, but also looking at histories of smaller cinema halls in and around the city. It's a really, really well-written, nicely written book. But there is one, of course, there is this looking at, there's a material history of it, but there are also histories written of like archives, the National Archives of National Film Archives, for example. There is also, certain way of writing history using, alternative archives. So, for example, there is Manju Idachira's work, which is about the constitution of Dalit archives and Dalit memory, which invents film history. So film history has been read as, along with urban history, along with histories of performance, history of material, architectural kind of histories. There's also a brilliant book by Sudhir Mahadevan, which is about the machine itself. It is called A Very Old Machine, and he writes about the cinematograph machine and its circulation in India, particularly Calcutta and so on, especially in the first part of the first 2 decades of 20th century. So there is and a larger sense is emerging where there are efforts to read history in what we call a more media archaeological way, which is to think about the history of cinemas not alone, not a standalone history, but a history that is linked intermediately with other histories, like with the history of radio, with the history of gramophone, with the history of television, for example, and now with the history of the internet and the digital space and so on. I mean, long and short, Sunny, to answer your question, one, I think that history has been, film history is now, majorly sort of, rewritten from these perspectives and this domains. But also, most importantly, I think it is also the mutability of cinema, which actually is very exciting for any kind of historian, right? I mean, if you look at any form of cinema that you want to think about, at the moment, it is difficult to not think about its various kinds of iteration from, analog film to now OTT platform, right? So this mutability of the film commodity, its very material aspects, etc., produce very exciting opportunities for us to think about, writing film history in this more deeper and complex way, and not just about the text and the narratives and so on. So there is much scope and there is much exploration happening there. I don't know whether I answered your...
Yeah, thank you. I know it's a wide sort of a question, but I just want to know this methodological, some kind of tensions happen between these disciplines, right? So I just just want to know your take on that. Thank you. Yeah.
We will talk more later.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, in conversation. So, no, I think also Dr. Sebastian did talk about it a little bit in a different way, right? So, okay.
Theme of films during pre-independent period.
You mean to say the theme of films?
Yeah, ma'am. Theme of films.
It's a good. It's a good question to think about. Are there any? Okay, yeah, I think I got the question. So, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about thematically. Are there any shifts, etc.? For example, people often say that there is more thriller in certain periods. There are certain, there is melodrama in certain period. There is social cinema in certain period, etc. But I do not know whether we can easily, create types out of, this really large corpus of films. What is interesting for us to think about is, one, if there are certain kinds of films emerging, let's say thematically emerging at a certain point of time, how is it resonating with, everything that's happening otherwise, like socially, industrially, etc. Right? That's one one way to think about this theme question. Second is that very often, if you start looking for themes, you would be very pleasantly surprised as to, to see very, very, unimagined kind of themes happening in the in a period where we don't expect it, right? Like there will be an odd film text sitting in the 1940s, for example, which would surprise us. But to quickly answer your question, one, when we're talking about Malayalam films, we're talking about a very small corpus of films till the late 1940s, right? Like between 1930, when Vigada Kumaran was made, and 1949, there are only about 8 films which are made in Malayalam, right? But thematically, by the late 1940s, the Malayalam cinema seemed to be thinking that it's important to not take the mythological route, right, which is very prominent in Tamil and so on. That you will also see a lot of resentment towards Tamil mythologicals, etc., in the 1940s. And more interest in the Telugu social films in the 1940s, for example, right? For the reason that seems to be talking about more important, questions that concern family and society and the individual and so on. So by late 1940s, there seems to be a interest emerging more in social themed films, right? So these are some larger observations that one can make, right? So for example, in Indian film history, one would see a presence of, you will see mythologicals present all through the history of Indian cinema. But mythologicals are more in the early period, and then you will see a change in, for example, more than mythologicals, there is a focus on, or there are more films which are devotional in nature, right? Which is not about gods, but which are more about saints who are intermediaries between God and the, human beings. So films like Sant Tukaram, etc. So there are certain kinds of thematic clustering which happens in short periods. But if you ask me, that is not a very good way for us to understand, how does cinema work? This never works in such a way that there are same films. There will always be films which, there will always be, mythologicals and devotional. There will always be melodrama. You will always see, crime thrillers. You will see swashbucklers. You will see, simultaneously, right, in the same time period. So this is what I will more or less answer, because I don't think that it's also not very useful to think that 1950s you have socials, 1960s you have melodrama, 1970s you have crime. That would probably help us to understand some trends which occur for a brief while, but that wouldn't describe or portray the whole picture of the film landscape for us. Hope I didn't disappoint you, Joby.